Yeah, Simona Stapkus. And he says, it would be interesting to hear more on the current Chinese stance regarding the Russia-Ukrainian war. What is a Chinese stance on that?
Okay, this is a very complicated question. Because on the one hand, there is their current political stance, and then there's the lessons they're drawing from it. So, of course, China supports Russia in all kinds of ways. Make sure that Russia can continue to sell its goods despite sanctions, help Russia convert currency and gold bullion, get around various problems. So China is helping prop up Russia's economy and is positioning itself as somewhat neutral vis-a-vis the conflict, but in practice wants Russia to weaken the United States, to draw resources into Europe, which Russia is doing in a mixed way. Also, in the latest kind of security update from NATO, and I'll have another video out of that in due course, if not already, where NATO has named China as a potential international security threat for the first time.
Just now?
Well, NATO is a North Atlantic treaty organization. It's focused on Europe, right? So it's hard to say that China is a military threat to Europe, okay?
Sure.
Which is true, but they've, for the first time, called China out as a potential threat to international security, okay? Yeah, I'm sure America would have loved them to do that many years ago, but this is the first time it's actually happened. And what I think is driving this is a recognition that Russia is so wedded to China's partnership that there's no point NATO pretending anymore. So before, I think there was a lot of hope, before the war in Ukraine, a lot of hope that Russia could eventually be pulled from China's orbit, that Russia could be shown to work with Europe, that relations between Russia and the Baltic, Russia and Ukraine, Russia and NATO would improve, and that Russia could be part of a victorious West rather than China's slave in a post-American world order.
Yeah. What's really binding Russia and China together? Is it this anti-US sentiment?
Yes. Yeah. Well, China wants to kick the United States out of Asia. That's China's goal. And they're pretty forthright about that. I mean, they don't say it in those words, but what they essentially say is, you know, the Taiwan question will be decided. We will not accept any foreign interference in our internal affairs. But China's definition of internal means pretty much all of Asia. And so that's their goal. And from China's perspective, this is their birthright. I mean, China was the most powerful political entity from essentially the Roman Empire to the 19th century, with a couple of blips in the middle there with the Mongols and so forth. But huge history where the world, from China's point of view, revolved around China, and China called the shots. Over the past 40 years, China has experienced massive double-digit compounding growth and is re-emerging, and the re bit is important here, re-emerging as a global power. China will seek to displace the United States, particularly in Asia, soon. Right? So Russia has felt that NATO's ever eastward expansion, that America's constant dissing of Russia and belittling of Russia from the Russian point of view, is showing that America is not a country that can be a partner of the Russian Federation. And then in some cases, I even agree with Russia. For example, in the post-Trump election, where the entire political establishment spent 4 years investigating whether Putin had put Trump in the White House through the Mueller. It was just insane. It made Russia seem like it was so much more powerful than it actually is. And one of the reasons I think the world miscalculated about Russia's military capabilities in invading Ukraine, it was just assumed that Russia would roll right into Ukraine, take over the whole country, no trouble. But in fact, in large part, that miscalculation, at least from the West point of view, was assuming Russia was way more powerful than it was. It had so much more control over influencing Western elections and so forth. Now, there are some parts of the world, such as the Baltic, where Russia has a lot more nefarious influence because it's right on Russia's border and they have a lot of Russian speakers. But Russia can't change elections in the United States. Donald Trump had because it's a domestic phenomenon, right? So Russia is going, well, America sees this as our enemy no matter what, and we see America as an enemy. And then we have the Velvet Revolution, so Ukraine going pro-Western, Macedonia, parts of Bulgaria, a lot of the Slavic world, they see this as being a Western ideal changes that are going on there. And that's a real threat to an autocratic Russia as well, where they don't want democracy to spread unfettered across the world. They want to put a check on that and say, essentially, that different countries can have different systems. And that's what they have in common with China. China says different countries have different cultures and different worldviews and different political systems.
And can still thrive.
And can still thrive. And it's not for the United States or anyone else to try and export their political ideology around the world. This is a big difference between today's Russia and Soviet Russia. Soviet Russia was a Marxist evangelistic nation trying to challenge the capitalist Western system. So two different worldviews, communism and capitalism, and exporting that through ideology in different parts of the world. Well, today's Russia doesn't do that. There's much more classic 19th century power politics realism with a throwback to the Russian Empire. If we listen to Vladimir Putin talk, he's talking about Peter the Great, those that expanded Russian territory, not some kind of obtuse Marxist ideology. And that's today's China is certainly not post-ideology, but is willing to incorporate capitalist ideals. And Russia is all about power politics. And both of them agree that a universalist worldview, i.e. that all people are created equal, that everyone should have equal rights under the law, there should be an independent judiciary, freedom of expression, that there are collective commons where there's a freedom of speech, freedom of oceans, freedom of space. That's all rejected by Russia and China. And so they work together to try and overthrow, essentially, the Western dominance. So how is China's viewing this conflict in Ukraine? Well, on the one hand, they're supporting Russia for that reason.
Yes.
The second thing, though, is they've been shocked by how effective the West has pulled together. Because both China and Russia were of the view that the West is not just in an economic decline relative to, for certainly China, but also a social decline. That there is a huge crisis of confidence. There is a massive cultural war going on between sort of, those with traditional values and those progressive values. That essentially the United States might even enter another civil war over all of this stuff. That they don't really believe in themselves. There's a lot of shame, and a lot of young people have views about colonial past sort of in Britain and Western Europe, or adopting postmodern ideas in the United States. The various things are happening on university campuses and in various elite institutions, and seeing these cultural wars and saying, look, the West is finished. They've tied up in knots over. They no longer have the underlying basis of their strength. Well, this has proven to be overstated. Okay, because
could you think like on social media, these culture wars have always existed, but they've just become louder?
No, I think there has been a genuine change, and we'll come back to that. I'll just finish this topic, but it is a great point. We'll come back to it. But I think what China has experienced is the same thing Russia has experienced in Ukraine, which is if you really do wake the West up, they can work together in a pretty cohesive way to challenge you, right? So the sanctions, the military support for Ukraine, the political unity, that is so much stronger and more far-reaching than Russia, China, or anyone else thought was possible. So when it comes to things like Taiwan, which would be a military intervention, it's not something that could just happen slowly. That I think the Chinese now realize that no, the Americans won't sit idly by. They won't be tied up domestically. That would mean a war between China and the United States. I think that the segment of Chinese society and political elite that was saying, look, we'll just invade Taiwan and America will meekly go back to its part of the Pacific Ocean. It won't risk a massive hegemonic war, potentially a nuclear war with China over an island that all speaks Chinese off the coast of Shanghai, right? That has a logic to it. But having seen the reaction in Ukraine, that voice in China is now silent, and they realize that if they invade Taiwan, that means war. And that changes, I think, the entire strategy for China when it comes to Taiwan. It means that they would have to also preemptively attack American bases in the Western Pacific, so in Okinawa, South Korea, Guam, Australia. Like, they would have to bring everybody else into the war. And this makes it a much bigger deal than what they originally envisaged, all because of the unity that the West showed in Ukraine. Now, there are some differences as well. Russia, when it went into Ukraine, most of the troops weren't even aware that they were they definitely didn't know they were about to go into a war zone.
That's true.
And they weren't really prepared to fight Ukrainians, fellow Slavs, a lot of people who spoke Russian. Whereas every person who joins the PLA in China has Taiwan in mind. If you join the military in China, it's because you want to go and unify Taiwan with the mainland. So they won't have any of that ideological trouble, right? They'll just be like, yes, we're finally doing what we were trained to do. And they'll do it with a great deal of enthusiasm and high morale. So it'll be, different. But China is viewing Ukraine with both lessons and opportunities.